I'm out today in the new Aston Martin DB12 Volante, and maybe I'm doing this wrong, but my favorite thing about this 671 horsepower car is actually the sun visors. Actually, the attention to detail inside this car, my goodness, it is splendid. I know we expect a luxury premium car like an Aston Martin to go a little over and beyond, but we also typically expect a brand like Aston Martin to kind of fall flat on some of those things. They're hand-built, for better and for worse. But in this case, there's a lot that really does seem for the better. It's just all around so beautifully considered. The attention to detail, my goodness. Just everything you touch in here is wrapped in leather. The sun visor's leather, the A-pillars leather, the full dash leather, even these little plastic bits on the seats, which on anything else would just be raw plastic, are leather. These tunnels through the seats beneath the headrests, those are wrapped both sides with leather. The steering wheel center pad, stitched leather, 2 separate pieces. The steering column, all leather. The base of the steering column, leather again. It's even stitched another layer and wrapped down underneath the rubber mat for the wireless phone charger. It's just so much leather. And then of course, what isn't leather is, in this case, as is tradition these days, open pore wood. And oh my goodness, it's so lovely. This particular palette is especially rich, warm, autumnal. The green on brown, honestly, a little bit Shrek in the case of this spec, but like, hear me out, sort of in a hot way? It's just so lovely to immerse yourself in. And really, this is what matters in this car, because it faces some stiff competition. And no, I'm not talking about the Ferrari Roma or anything like that. No, this car, and I'm gonna get hate comments from people who haven't driven either, really, in my mind, needs to measure up to the Lexus LC500, particularly the LC convertible. That car from 130 is about 1/3 the price of this thing as spec'd, but it is absolutely magnificent. I've long maintained, as do many of my peers in this industry, that it is in fact the finest car you can buy right now. The LC does so much right. That naturally aspirated 5-liter V8, a very well-considered interior, an interesting design, amazing top-down audio and top-down climate control. This Aston, at 3 times the price, better hit well beyond that. And not just that, it had better offer a greater sense of occasion too. So with that said, do 671 horsepower and 590 pound-feet make the difference? Well, no. But I'm not convinced that the powertrain really is what you're supposed to buy this car for. I was critical earlier this year of the new Aston Martin Vantage. It was a car that I really enjoyed, especially on the track. Very predictable, very usable. But there was something missing, and in that case, it was the powertrain. It was the Mercedes AMG-derived M177, that's the wet sump version, non-hybrid, twin-turbo 4-liter V8. That's the engine that was introduced in the C63 way back. It was in the E63. It's, by all accounts, a respectable German 4-liter twin-turbo V8. It makes its torque quite early. It's not like the little Porsche 4-cylinders, but it comes in from about 2,700 RPM and then just plateaus. It rides straight across to 6,000. That means you get your torque and then you're just riding that same torque. Technically fast, but spiritually uninspiring. The power curve is linear, and that is a good thing, but really it's the torque that matters, and that makes it kind of disappointing. Aston Martin's role then is to try to tune that into something more colorful, and in particular, to make it handle in a somehow interesting way. Now, in the case of the Vantage, they absolutely pulled that off. In particular, the Vantage's ability to let you dial in exactly how much rear-end play you wanted was a real highlight on the circuit. This here, at some 4,200 pounds though, is not such a weapon. This is meant as a grand tourer. Like the LC, this is something meant to cruise that can bring a little life and accelerate out of corners when you want it to, but that really brings more of the cruising comfort accessibility when you're driving to Montreal or into the Alps, what have you. And to be sure, you do feel greater comfort in here than the Vantage. Longer wheelbase, steadier all-around ride, a lot less twitchy. And notably too, this is a car that doesn't feel like it's egging you on all the time to do something stupid. In the Vantage, it was tricky driving through town because you just wanted to give it all the time. It's just such an exciting and excitable car. This here has been surprisingly pleasant just to dawdle about in. I've definitely had some silly fun. You know, my fuel economy this week has ranged from 15 to 17 liters per 100 kilometers. And that is a fair bit more than it's supposed to get according to NRCan figures if you're driving it like a responsible grown-up. But then, is that really why you run around in this? No, you buy this because it feels special and because it can go brrrt when you want it to. Now, to its credit, the Mercedes power in this feels a little more lively than what I've felt with AMG power in some other cars. It still feels a certain bit detached. It makes the noises and it makes them from the right place instead of just out of woofers like we've grown used to. But you don't get that beautiful induction noise that you do out of an NA, particularly, again, that 5-liter Lexus. Also missing from that 5-liter Lexus V8 is, of course, the presumption of just endless reliability that you would see out of the LC. The Mercedes power doesn't quite boast that same cred. And then, of course, there's the way that that torque comes in. Arriving all right out the gate and just plateauing, riding straight across, it doesn't really build a sense of anticipation. This is a car that just gives you everything right up front, all at once. And to be honest, I feel that that somewhat cheapens the experience of power. Yeah, you can do 3.7-second acceleration, cool. That is a more correct number, I would argue, than some of the faster cars. 3.7 is on the quick end, but it still gives you time to enjoy it, to savor it at least a little bit. I wish it were a little slower, but then everything has to go fast these days. Now, I should say here too, it's not that I am just plainly opposed to borrowed powertrains. Aston's been doing this for a long time, as have many other boutique manufacturers. When you're working to a development budget, it makes a lot of sense. And honestly, as we've seen from, for instance, TVR, having your own engine can be spectacular, can also be a nightmare. With that being said, I would in a way have liked to see another V8 used here. Something like the classic AJ8 V8. That thing, as used in the Jag SVRs, is a supercharged riot, but is admittedly on its way out. Modern EU6 regs, and particularly the incoming EU7, and of course North American CAFE standards, are really putting the squeeze on some of those classic big displacement, big honkers. Also a little disappointing, as I complained about in the Vantage, is the choice to use the ZF8HP automatic transmission. It's a plenty respectable 8-speed auto. It's used in basically everything nowadays though, and that makes it feel kind of unremarkable. Of course, it's used in everything for a reason, but that does take away some of the specialness. Now, I've asked Aston Martin engineers in the past about why they've chosen the ZF8 in their current offerings instead of something more exciting, and they say that they have played around with DCTs in their internal development and testing, but that this automatic transmission just affords a seamlessness of power and a dependability that they couldn't really say no to. And in fairness, I can't really fault them for that. They're trying to make a car that works, and a car that offers its performance in a smooth, refined manner. It just makes sense. But then, power, whatever. Everything nowadays makes 600 plus horsepower. No, you've got to set this apart with something more. So, sense of occasion. Well, that, yes, comes a bit from the exhaust note, but really, it comes from this cabin. And I really do need to come back to what I opened with, because these sun visors are something truly special. It seems silly to get excited about them, but they're a part that's really often overlooked. So many cars just throw in something from the parts bin, it's whatever, there'll be a little light above it, cool. Here though, we've got really nice polished chrome hinges. They're rock solid, they look really satisfying even when the thing is folded up. Fold it down, and we've got this gorgeous sliding door over the mirror, which itself is really big, nice, and proper, beautiful glass. The little thumb divot on this cover though, that really stands out. Your thumb just sort of settles into it. It's this really soft, easy, gentle little spot. It's just such a sensory delight and something that you wouldn't think of as a point to appreciate on a car, let alone a supercar adjacent tourer like this. The controls too are really nice. They've got a good heft to them. You've got hard buttons basically everywhere, and the micro switches have a nice firmness to them. They aren't tinny, plasticky like you'll find in an Alpha, for instance. We've got leather again on the drive select. We've also got a really nice, hefty, damped feeling to these 4 rotaries here. They are admittedly a little tricky to get used to, and you have to look down to figure out which one is which in the dark, but they feel great under the finger, and they can be tapped in for different settings as well. A little frustrating though is how everything is a hard button except for the seat heaters. Those are capacitive, and just as in the Vantage they annoyed me, so too do they bug me here. The reason for that? Well, basically anytime you reach for anything else, it's really easy to skim over them. I found this in particular when I was tracking the Vantage even, that I was brushing over them with my arm and elbow and accidentally triggering the seat heater in 30-odd degree weather there in Spain. It wasn't a nice feeling as they started to get real spicy hot and I started to get real swampy. There are other little frustrations as well. The new infotainment is pretty nice, and big credit to Aston. They've done it right, and we finally are seeing OLED screens rolled out. That means that your black pixels are simply not illuminated at all. They are properly black. And that means that at night, you don't have dark black pixels still blinding you with light pollution. Also nice is just the general style of the infotainment. It's really clean to look at. Unfortunately, it's a little bit confusing to navigate, and especially when you're on the go. More frustrating still is that it's been freezing on me a lot. I fired the car up about 25 minutes ago, and sometimes it eventually wakes up from a startup freeze, but in this case, it's still absolutely stuck. It's just pointless here. I can get out, lock the car, and try it again, but it just shouldn't be this way. Ahead of me too, we've got a digital cluster, which yes, lends a lot of versatility, but to be honest, especially in a cabin that brings this much premium feel everywhere else, it feels rather cheap. That's not just because it's a straight rectangular display either, but it just should be something more jewel-like in a car like this. Aston Martin's clusters, and particularly thinking back to the DB9 DBS of, for instance, the Casino Royale era, really were something special with their opposite swept gauges and their almost jewel-like needles. Here, it's just a screen. This could be anything. And honestly, it's not even a particularly interesting screen to look at too. It's just there. It's awkward to navigate too, with a very simple menu that's still kind of slow and unresponsive when you're using these capacitive pads here on the steering wheel. They just don't feel good. Also disappointing is the general plastic construction of these button pads here. When I knock the paddle shifter back, I will sometimes feel this whole panel boop a little bit. It's just got this plasticiness that feels really out of place for this cabin. Something else that I would have liked to feel is something to damp the feeling of the paddle returning. It goes back with just sort of a plasticky clack. I know that's really fussy, but at $370,000, I think I'm allowed to be fussy here. Finally, we have to talk about wind isolation because, well, it's not bad, it isn't great. Whereas the Lexus LC500 clearly went through endless computational fluid dynamics testing to get that airflow over the top just right to maintain this perfectly isolated low pressure zone in the cabin, we do get a little bit of billowy buffeting. It does tug at the hair a little bit, especially at highway speed. That impacts cabin noise and really docks points from what should be a really special, blissful touring cabin experience. It also makes more noise to crowd out the honestly underwhelming standard audio in this. Now, you can get an 1100 plus watt upgraded system in this, and honestly, I would encourage you to, because the 300 some odd watts output here just don't cut it. They're muddy, and even at max volume, just leave a lot to be desired. Now, if you're like me and you really enjoy the feeling of driving a convertible in the cold with the heat blasting, you may be a little underwhelmed with part of the setup here. The footwells and the outer side vents do a very good job. However, these center vents, basically useless. They put in a very narrow stream of air and you can't really point it at yourself. It's still just bound to sort of the shoulder width at best. So then, the sensible road test stuff out of the way, but where does that leave us? Well, it's kind of funny here. I have a long list of grievances with the DB12 here. There's a lot about it that isn't perfect. And again, referencing that LC500, most of those problems don't exist there. I know a lot of people will get caught up on the badge. They'll say, well, this is an Aston Martin. And in referencing the LC in conversations, people have objected that, oh, but that doesn't have soul, the Aston does. And that's a statement that I deeply disagree with. In fact, if anything, as I think I've expressed, the Powertrain here leaves that at a slight disadvantage on that point. But if you get past that, and if you overlook the general sort of starstruck reaction that a lot of people will have to this, there's still something special. The Aston DB12 just carries itself with a certain I don't know what. And that's not just because you've ticked the je ne sais quoi option box either. There's just this sort of intangible wonder to this deeply tactile, tangible car. There's just so much to touch, feel, and enjoy here. From the beautiful semi-metallic, actually, leather to the wonderful sliding mirror covers here on the sun visors. It's just a special place to be. And for all of the silly little flaws, for all of the goofy little things like the door handle that broke this week, it still feels like, who cares? You know full well what you're getting into when you pick up a car like this. I am unsurprised by little things going wrong. It's an Aston. That's gonna be the way. If anything, I'm surprised that more hasn't gone wrong. It's not just an Aston thing either. I have had so many issues in Ferraris, my goodness. But then it does the things, and I'm not even talking about the burts like in so many others. It does the things, but it also makes you feel special in a very particular kind of way. I don't generally talk about myself in these things, and particularly the whole transition bit, but I've been thinking a lot about one of my colleagues, Victoria Scott, who actually was instrumental in my coming out as a trans woman. She wrote a piece some time ago, also in an Aston. She called it The Vantage Point of Transness back in the early drafts. And basically, it came down to that she could pull up most anywhere, even at the most jean shorts, Corvette driving country club. And I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say this on camera, but you could just sort of feel like that bitch. And that really is the way here. Just as she wrote, you get out and you feel like no one can mess with you. Yeah, you're a bit of an oddity. You look a little bit out of place. You're not what people expect. But with that sort of stylish entrance, it's hard to really say anything. With that, I felt a different sort of peace this week that I'm not used to feeling. I definitely still feel the stares, but they're a little different here in the DB12. They're a little special. I feel like that. For Driving.ca, I'm Al Alder.